All right, welcome everybody to Tuesday, September 26th meeting of Kubernetes SIG service catalog. Doug, go ahead and let's start running through the agenda.
All right, first up, Morgan, cluster ID discussion.
Can somebody share their screen and show the agenda?
Morgan, you want to do that since you've been doing it in the past? Actually, Paul, can you unmute Morgan? Sometimes it's...
1 second, fine, 1 second.
Oh, there you go, he got it.
As soon as the computer stops being frozen. Come on, okay. Is that it?
Yep, you can see it.
What was the, we just wanted to discuss the description of it, or?
Yeah, let's discuss the cluster ID proposal that you have.
Okay. I figure this comes out of like just lots of discussion in that issue that Simon made after making the PR that sort of took a page from what KubeADM was doing. There's many other alternatives. This is the let's make a new API for this particular thing, with the thought that maybe it could be extended later to have more fields, but for the purposes of getting something out there, we're going to have an API that's basically just put cluster info separate from its own API group or whatever, so it's a separate thing that can be moved around, and then the ID is a string, and everything that follows from that is fairly self-evident, other than if we want to initialize it, how do we initialize it? The default proposal here is just generate some kind of random string, GUID, whatever. So this is sort of the let's make an API and put it out there, and then make it easier to for now, part of our stuff. Later, make it easier to either install on demand or make it part of core, move it over there. Let the sort of ecosystem of APIs prove that it's valuable or not, the market strategy sort of thing. I mean, it's all his questions. It's all in there for the most part. There's nothing confusing, I don't think. But
Are you done?
yeah.
Okay. So I just raised my hand just to give a little bit of background for why we were looking at this issue, for those of you who may not have been paying attention to this particular side of things. In the Open Service Broker API specification, as part of the context object that we send along with each request, we need to include information about the platform itself. So, for example, in Cloud Foundry, they'll send things like the organ space. In Kubernetes, we're going to send things like the namespace, GUID, or something like that. And one of the other pieces of information that we're passing along in the Kubernetes side is the unique cluster ID, which is meant to uniquely identify which particular Kubernetes cluster this request is actually for. Because there are some environments where the, quote, platform as defined by the Service Broker API actually spans multiple Kubernetes clusters. And so if the service broker ever needs to reach back into Kubernetes or the platform to get something done, it may need to know which exact Kubernetes instance this request was specifically related to. So that's why we need this unique identifier. And we've been trying to push this into Kubernetes core because other people have expressed an interest in needing similar types of a similar type of field, meaning a cluster ID. But after a long discussion at SIG architecture, they decided, well, for right now, let's go ahead and just let each individual sort of part of Kubernetes define their own cluster ID. And if at some point in the future we decide to harmonize on a single one, we can always change it later. But as of right now, they basically said, service catalog, go define your own, manage it yourself, and do whatever you need to get your job done. So just a little bit of background for people. All right, Paul, I believe you're up next.
Okay, so I have a number of things floating around in my head. The first one is, what part of the is this going to be sent in the context profile? What part of the request is this sent on?
Yeah, the cluster ID is part of the context field property, whatever you want to call it, the chunk. That's part of the open source broker API. Yeah.
I gotcha. So one thing that comes to mind is that there's separate guidance for Cloud Foundry users that want to support multiple Cloud Foundries. You might, and this is not really for this audience, but you might talk about that in Open Service Broker API Working Group. The next one is, what level of API is this going to be at? Like, is it alpha? I don't see that in the document.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. You know, we can make it alpha, we can make it whatever.
I strongly suggest that it should be alpha, because I think you probably have a number of surprises waiting for you. So do yourself a favor and make it alpha would be my suggestion.
Okay.
I think there are a number of questions about the implementation of this that I have. I suggest you think about how you're going to ensure there's only one of these things, which is an API semantic we don't have anywhere else. And when I look at the section called value and I see string created on startup, it doesn't say startup of what. So is this the controller manager making this? Is the API server self-bootstrapping, which is another thing that I don't think we do. So it's worth spending some time going into more specifics. And I also wonder, what's the API group name for this?
Making one up as we go.
Okay. The other thing that I'll mention is that I could easily imagine that, like, it might be faster if you need something right now as a stopgap, to add something to the controller manager that's like, this is the cluster ID that I want you to send. I would have no problem with something like that going in, and then once this resource and API group are closer to fully baked, we can switch it over, or hide the option, all that kind of stuff. Just if you need something, you know, right away, because I expect that it might not be super obvious what the right way to implement some of these semantics is. That's it from me.
All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay. It sounds like, Paul, you had some questions there, but it was more just looking for some clarifications. Is there any objection to Morgan starting to head down this path? I'm not asking for a concrete decision that says, yes, this is ultimately the design we want to go with, but rather let Morgan continue heading down this path, because it seems like it's it might be the right direction, but we'll see how it plays out?
I mean, I don't have any objection to that. I guess one thing that I have a question about that's in the agenda is it says SIG to own this and driving Kubernetes features, and I'm not sure what that means given that it's going to be an R repository to start with.
There were a couple people who were pinging me. Basically, they saw the sort of document I wrote up, or they heard the discussion Doug or me or whoever had with the people in Arch, and basically wanted somebody to sort of create a thing in the features repo for 1.9, and I guess we have to. I'm not familiar with that process so much, but I guess we have to have somebody or a SIG or something to push it or to own it or to do whatever the process is. And you know, I had a couple people ask if we could do this, so I wanted to see what people thought, if they wanted to consider doing that, owning it, pushing it, whatever. So that's what that's what that line was about. This the second bit.
Okay, I think that only needs to be done if it's something that touches the Kubernetes core. We can check on that. My gut says I don't think that we have to do it, but we can certainly find out.
Okay. So is there any objection to giving Morgan the go-ahead to start hanging on this path and see where it leads us? All right. I'm not hearing any. While I take some more notes, Morgan, why don't you go ahead and do the next discussion? That's yours as well.
I think this was all based on the last meeting of discuss the discuss this stuff. They can copy that in there. So I didn't really have anything I needed to say. Just what did we want to discuss about the plugin concerns and whatnot.
So I think the last meeting where we discussed this, people were going to think about how we're going to package it, what commands do we want to release, how are we going to version it, what versioning scheme, what level of API do we consider it, stuff like that. Doug, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like our time would be best served rather than trying to hash through possible proposals for each of these things. Morgan, why don't you take the AI to come up with some rough ideas for how to do each one of these concerns that I think, Paul, you're the one that pretty much mentioned these last time. So Morgan, why don't you take the AI to come up with some proposals for each of these three, and then when we have concrete proposals, then we can actually discuss them. I'd rather not do brainstorming necessarily on this particular call.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. In that case, let's move on to Kent. I think you want to talk about name of service instance credential.
Yeah. So I had come to realize just recently, because admittedly I've been kind of absent lately, I came to realize recently about this name change from service binding to service instance credential. And I thought it was odd, but I just kind of moved on. I didn't care that much. But then Gabe started complaining about it. And his criticisms of it, I think, are valid. That besides being extremely difficult to type, the name is also a complete misnomer, in that the thing that it represents is not actually a credential or credentials at all. It's a request for credentials, and we already have a word for that in the OSB vernacular, and that is binding. So Aaron and Gabe and I were unanimous on that within Microsoft, and we briefly discussed with Paul yesterday, and he indicated that we might not be the only ones unhappy with that name. So I asked that we discuss this again.
Okay, my hand's up. So just for some history, so we switched from binding to service instance credential because binding wasn't accurate as well. In the past, we were trying to have a single resource that represented the notion of get me some credentials and then inject it into something. So I actually did have this notion of, quote, binding within it, meaning the action of sticking credentials into an application. Since then, we've dropped the notion of the injection side of things as being part of the resource we're dealing with here. So to have the word binding in there really isn't very accurate. And I believe, if I remember correctly, that we did have plans post-beta to introduce additional resources that did possibly have the word binding in there because they were going to do the injection. And that's why we ended up where we did, where we said, okay, we don't necessarily call it binding anymore. And so we landed on this kind of ugly name, Service Instance Credential. Just anyway, I just want to provide some more history behind it. Anyway, Paul, you're up.
So I've heard a lot about this from folks that are at Red Hat and in the community, and I don't think the name is great. I don't think it's easy to explain, and I think if we did something like service binding, it would be easier to explain, more in line with the API, and people, I think, would get it that like you do a service binding, and then to really use it in your application, you make an instance of another resource. So I don't see that there's a huge problem with like having binding in the name. And this is the time to change it. If people like do not like this name, this is the single best and really only time to change it. So I've heard enough about this from people that when Kent approached me, I finally said, okay, I've heard about this from a number of different groups. Let's get it back on the agenda. You up.
All right, Vila, you're up.
Yeah, so I'm just going to say +1. It's a terrible name. And when I got back from vacation, I saw it had been changed and tried to revert that change unsuccessfully. So I'm just going to say +1 billion to this. Let's go back to sanity.
Okay, so I'll raise my hand now. I don't necessarily have a huge problem with going back to something like service binding, other than I think it's going to be really kind of confusing if we do introduce, for example, Paul, you had suggested, what was it, pod preset binding or something like that, right? I think that's going to be really kind of confusing because now we're going to have two resources called binding, and only one of them actually does a binding. I don't believe most users will understand the first use of binding, meaning, oh, go talk to the service broker and get credentials. Why does that do a binding? It's not actually binding to anything at all. It's just asking for credentials. And I don't think most people even really will know open service broker APIs even being used behind the scenes. All they care about is hook my application up to a service. They're not going to understand OSB at all. So that's my biggest concern, is using the word binding there. I think it's going to be even more confusing when we introduce the other objects later on. Vile? Or is that?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, so
Okay.
basically, and I don't think those should be called bindings at all. I mean, they should basically be something like injectors or last mile helpers or God knows what. But I mean, their function is very specific, which is going to be very specific to a particular environment. I mean, I had hoped that they would be, the binding would basically have some way of, the existing service binding would have the ability to be pluggable, so you could define behaviors, meaning this is how I want to consume these credentials in my applications. But it seems like there was this split between there was this change to go ahead and only introduce very low-level primitives and leaving a lot of behaviors unspecified or left as an exercise for the passes, I guess, to implement now. So I assume Red Hat does something with their bindings and IBM does something else with their bindings. or secrets or whatever. But I don't think they would be bindings. I think they would be something else.
Professor Sherpa. All right, Kent, you're up.
Yeah, so I think that I might be missing part of the story here, in terms of, you know, when we're talking about injecting credentials into a pod and that sort of thing. I might be missing a little bit of context in terms of what the intent is there long term. I mean, today, the thing that is created in response to a binding is a secret, and a pod just consumes those secrets in the way it would consume any other secret. And are we talking about doing something different in the future? If I had that context, it might change my view of this. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's important to remember sort of the history here, right? And my hand's up. Cloud Foundry introduced the word binding for this action to the broker because that's exactly what they were doing from the end user point of view, right? They were injecting the credentials into an application. So they were doing they're doing a binding action. So it makes perfect sense. And it's important to point out that Cloud Foundry actually does allow people to create credentials without doing a binding. And they don't use the word binding in that case. They call them service keys, right? So they actually go off and explicitly from the command line, from the end user perspective, they say, create a service key. That, to me, helps solidify the idea that if that's really what we're doing in our world here, meaning we're just creating the credentials, we are not doing an injection, AKA binding, using the word binding there really isn't appropriate. And I'd much rather follow Cloud Foundry's lead in this case. And if we don't like the word service instance credentials, which I agree is a horrible name, then maybe call them service instance keys or something like that, because I think that more accurately represents what we're doing here. But using the word binding when we're not actually binding anything, especially from an end user perspective, I think is really confusing. Relay, you're up.
You skipped me, Doug.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you in there. Oh, sorry. You scrolled off the top. Sorry, go ahead, Paul. I apologize.
So I would take service key over service instance credential any day of the week. EOF.
Okay. Let's see, next on the list, Vile.
So because creating one of these, creating a service X, where that service X is whatever it is, actually results typically in a call to a service broker, and in the binding, it seems fine to not introduce yet another thing called service key, but keeping it as binding. I mean, I had never heard anybody while we have been developing and people using it to come back and saying, I don't understand what service binding is. I don't understand why we did that initial change. Still, I just know it was done, but I don't know why.
Okay, Kent, you're up.
Yeah, I would echo what Vile just said, that I don't think there really was any confusion about what binding meant. But if we want to be consistent, when we create a resource of type instance, that is reflected in the calls out to the broker, right? You make an OSB call to create an instance. I don't see why this should be any different. That to affect a call to a broker that will execute a binding, you should be creating an instance called binding. Just in the name of consistency, I think that's a simple model that makes sense and wasn't really confusing anybody.
Okay, hold on. Trying to take some notes at the same time. So I think I'm up next. Hold on, let me just double check and make sure I'm not lying. Yeah. So Vile, I understand what you're saying, but I don't think it's necessarily a fair analysis because we don't have those other resources in the model right now. So people only have the notion of bindings, right? They don't have the thing afterwards that I claim is going to introduce the confusion, meaning another resource called binding, which actually does a binding, right? I mean, yeah, we could call them injectors instead of bindings, but I don't think that's necessarily going to help the case, right? Because how do you explain the word binding when all you're doing is creating a secret? What are you binding to? Where does that verb come into play? I don't know how to explain that to people. So I'd love to understand how you might explain it other than by saying service broker calls it binding. So Philae, you're up.
Yeah, I basically would say that it basically explicitly declares your intent to use a service instance from some thing. And when I say thing, I'm being vague because in Kubernetes, there is no sane concept to define an application like in a Cloud Foundry. There it's very clear where you want to go and use those credentials from, or basically consume a service from. That's what we are really saying is, I would like to use that service from this thing. And in Kubernetes, we don't really have that, but the intent is still the same, which we sort of kind of had with the pod preset. We at least said, well, we want to go ahead and consume that thing. So we want to consume a service from this set of pods. So at least there was some notion of being able to say who is using this service, which we are kind of losing by just slapping a service into a namespace. But that's nor here or there. But I think the act of binding the consumer to a service instance is really at the crux of this thing. That's what you're doing when you're declaring that, and that is the act of binding. The other part, which is the injection, is really just the last mile consumption that is defined by the what I call the runtime environment. So the runtime environment in say Cloud Foundry, it is in the environmental variables, and you get some stuff slapped into the environmental variables. On something like Google App Engine, they also have something similar where you can get these things injected in there as well. On Kubernetes, it's dealer's choice right now, right? You basically say, well, I know there's a secret and I have to change my pod spec. But also, there's a lot of Helm charts or go bys or whatever else where modifying the pod spec on the disk, so to speak, is not really desirable. And you would want to go ahead and just define a behavior like a decorator where you just basically say, well, you know what, for these things, just inject those things into there. And that's not really a binding. It's just controlling your consumption model. And I view those two things as very orthogonal and not binding. That is not a binding to me.
Okay, Paul, you're up.
So I want to just point out here, there are two different facets. One is that no one seems to like the name Service Instance Credential. The other one is, what should the name be? So I think it's pretty clear from the feedback that we're getting here that we need a better name. Does anybody disagree about that? I hear no disagreement. So then the question is, what should the name be? And that's all I've got at this moment.
Okay, Kent, you're up.
Yeah, so I want to be fair to you, Doug, and say that I think that you have thought through this and reasoned through this in ways that maybe some of us are struggling to see. And I don't think that it means that you're wrong. I think maybe some of us are not seeing what you're seeing. But with that being said, if there's a concern that binding, for instance, is a difficult concept to convey to people, I would be more worried that what you're trying to communicate to us that isn't clicking with us would be even more so difficult to communicate to people when trying to educate people on these concepts. So that's just one concern that I have here.
Yeah, and I kind of understand that, but at the same time, We have sort of a extra knowledge, right? In the sense that we all live with the open source broker API spec. And so we're kind of mixing those two worlds, and it's easier for us to wrap our heads around these things, right? I try really hard to look at these things from a strict end user perspective, right? And I knowing that we have this other resource coming along in the future that's going to be doing this injecting, and whether you want to call it injector versus binding, it all means the same thing to me. And we're going to have two resources with the same type of verb on them, and one of them actually isn't doing that thing. I'm going to have a really hard time justifying that to people who aren't living and breathing with the open source broker API spec on a database basis the same way we are. To Vile, to your point that, this is the creating a binding is, never mind. I was going to say something based on what you said earlier in front. I just jumped out of my head. So let me just stop there before I say something completely stupid. So I apologize. So let me just say this. So Kent, you're right. It's not the credential. It's a request for a credential. You're right. I mean, and technically we want to be 100% accurate, saying, service key request or service credential request is probably more accurate from a word perspective. I agree, Paul. I'm not suggesting we go that route, but at least it's not implying that it's part of the injection into an application, because you may never actually do that. And it doesn't have to be done. You could just simply ask for the secret. I mean, you could simply ask for the credentials to be created and then export the secret and take it someplace else. That's actually what some people do in the Cloud Foundry world, right? And there's no binding at all in this entire process. So again, it's a case of we have a verb on there that isn't accurately representing what's going on. That's my biggest concern here. So anyway, are there any people want to raise their hand to discuss this anymore, or are we sort of maxed out the discussion on that? So Kent, you're up.
Yeah, I just want to put a question to the group, which is what do take Kubernetes out of it completely for a moment and just speak purely in terms of OSB. What is it that we believe a binding to be? Because Ville, you used the words earlier, which I agreed with completely, that it was an explicit declaration of intent to use something. And does anybody disagree with that? Because
I disagree.
Okay, you disagree with that.
Paul, I apologize for jumping the queue, but since he asked, I explicitly disagree because of the use case where you can just ask for the credentials. If you look at the Open Source Broker API spec, they encourage you to pass in an app GUID during the binding request, right? And that I agree is the intent to say, hey, I'm going to inject it to this particular application. But if you don't have an application because you're not going to, either you don't have it right then or you're never going to actually inject it into an application, I'm not expressing intent to inject it at that point. I'm just asking for some credentials. What I'm going to do with them later on, you don't know. If I may not do anything at all. So I apologize. Go ahead, Ken. You can continue.
Yeah, I'm just to respond to that. I'm not clear on where in the OSB spec it says you can ask for credentials without binding.
If you look at the binding request, the app GUID is an optional field.
The app GUID is an optional field. Okay, so you're saying that you're saying that hypothetically you don't need to be an application to do binding. You can just submit a binding without saying who you are.
Exactly. Yes.
But does that really make it not a declaration of intent to use the thing? It might not be conveying who the user is, but I think the fact that you're trying to obtain credentials through a process called binding is still a declaration of intent.
I agree it's an intent to ask for some credentials, but I may never actually bind them to an application. I may just export those credentials, take them someplace else, and use them someplace else, completely outside of what I'm doing here.
Okay, I'm done with my hand raising.
Okay, yeah, Paul, I apologize. Go ahead.
Okay, so I think that there is a way to potentially make everybody a little happier, or at least equally miserable. So for clarity, what we have talked about vis-a-vis pod presets in the future and VCAP services, for the record, is to have another set of resources where I'm going to call this, this is ServiceInstanceCredential / service binding / service key. This is the OSB binding resource. That doesn't look like a word. So this represents the OSB binding. And then can everybody see that? Is that actually visible to people?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is another set of resources like pod preset binding that have a reference to this, or VCAP services binding that have a reference to this thing, and that you would create this one and you'd create this one, and the controller that backs the pod preset or the VCAP services binding would be watching Open Service Broker binding, and when that thing became ready, it would start doing its work. So what I'm thinking to myself is that maybe we can change the formula a little bit so that, and just for clarity, to be super, super extra clear beyond my ordinarily high level of clarity, let's say hypothetically that we chose to call this service key. And instead of you create this one and you create this one, or you create this one and you create this one, that instead, let's see, what's the most appealing thing to the most people? So say that, forget about this one for now. Say that when you create a pod preset binding, as part of pod preset binding's spec, similar to how Kubernetes deployments contain the pod template, or it's the pod template. So what if pod preset binding had a service key template, and instead of creating this one and you create this one, what if you create this one and the controller that backs this one, the pod preset binding, what if it's watching, this is in some API server somewhere. So what if the controller is watching this, and the controller says, aha, there's a new pod preset binding. I am going to make, and this is Service Catalog API server. These might be the same API server, they might not be, doesn't really matter. I think that we need to allow people to build, outside service catalogs, so let's assume they're different. So this controller, when it sees the pod preset binding get created, it actually creates this. And it establishes a watch and waits for the service key resource to become ready, and then does whatever else it needs to do for pod preset binding. What if we did something like that, where we could, you could then wind up explaining to users, you just create the pod preset binding, you use the service key template to make sure the service key that gets created for it is just so, and then we have less of a problem about these two different things with similar sounding names, in the sense that, like, if all you ever care about is pod presets, you don't even have to worry about service key, except as part of your pod preset. And likewise, we could perhaps reformulate the idea for VCAP service binding, which I think IBM has been interested in. I think it would have some utility for anybody else that wanted interoperability between Cloud Foundry applications and Kubernetes is. And Ken, since I'm still talking, I'm going to answer your question now. So basically, Kent, the short answer about what pod preset binding is we got some feedback from the community that said that a lot of people aren't interested in pod presets. They don't want pod presets coupled to service catalog, or rather they don't want service catalog coupled to pod presets. And we also, at the same, around the same time, we're getting feedback that other parties in the community wanted to build other types of integrations. So the idea for removing the pod preset fields from what was called at the time the binding resource was that we would make the service catalog API group exclusively focused on the nucleus of what you need to interact with Open Service Broker API, and for integrations like pod presets or VCAP services, we would build other resources outside the service catalog API group. Maybe they're in our API server, maybe they're not. That would handle those other integrations. Does that make sense to you, Ken? Kent, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the way that all of this works today is that when you've done a binding or you've gotten a service instance credential, it creates a secret, and we consume the applications consume the secrets. Is this some alternative to that?
Well, the pod preset binding would be integration with pod preset, so that you did not have to change the pod spec in every pod you wanted to consume this thing, or change a deployment or replica set. Like, the community is still interested in pod preset as a mechanism for consuming these things, but it became pretty clear from community feedback at one point that embedding the details of the pod preset directly into the resource that represented the Open Service Broker binding wasn't the right formula, and a fair amount of people seem to have objections to it. So it's basically the same type of behavior that we had always discussed vis-a-vis pod preset and service catalog, just in a different resource.
Okay, Paul, are you done?
I'm done for now.
Okay, for the warning for now. Okay, Billy, I think you're next.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically I made a comment there before we basically said that it's just a request, but it really isn't. We are basically saying very analogously to the Cloud Foundry, that when those credentials get created, today the unit of injection is namespace, unit of consumption is the namespace. We are basically saying that these credentials, please give me some credentials for a particular service instance, and I will use them from the namespace. That's what we are saying today, right? With the creation of the credentials. So we do have a consumer. It's not just give me credentials and they are not persisted anywhere or they are not available for consumption.
Okay, so my hand's up next. So the wording you use, Vile, isn't quite the wording I would use, but I understand what you're saying. I don't necessarily disagree. You're right that the secret is created into a namespace, and the secret is scoped to that namespace. But I think Kent's question about, what the heck is this pod preset binding thingy? I think that's a really good one to make sure everybody has a level set here. So
yes, but my hand was raised 5 minutes ago when Paul was on his rant and rave about designing the next 5 months of whatever. I want to come back to that issue because while the pod preset is a valid use case and so forth, I would like to go ahead and basically address Kent's original question, which is, Vila is right. Why are you guys arguing? I mean, those are not exactly the words that he used, but I know. But I want to go back to the point.
That's accurate paraphrasing, though.
You're right. We should just admit that Vila is right and just move on. I agree. But because we have 10 more minutes, we're going to keep going. So Kent, just again, more history here. You are correct that when you create a set of credentials, those credentials are put into a secret, and those secrets, or that secret lives in a namespace, and that yes, people are then free to use that secret however they choose to, the same way they can use a secret today. However, many moons ago, we decided that, gee, wouldn't it be nice if people could inject these secrets into their application, meaning their pods, without explicitly having to modify all their pod definitions, right? And that's where we came up with the pod presets, which allows you to say, create a brand new resource called the pod preset and say, for these pods over here, using a label selector, inject this secret. And that way you don't have to modify your pod spec anywhere, right? That pod preset, in essence, does the injection for you automatically into the covers, okay? And
what does it how?
I'm sorry, say it again?
It does it how?
It basically had an admission controller that noticed the spec, the pod spec coming through the system and said, oh, by the way, there's a pod preset that wants to modify this guy based upon labels, and it tweaked it under the covers for you automatically.
Sorry, I should clarify what I mean by how. Like from the perspective of the consumer, if you're the process running in the pod, what does this thing this thing that's been injected into your pod for you, how does it manifest? Is it a file? Is it an environment variable? What is it?
Right. In the same way you can tell it how to inject secrets into your pod by modifying the pod spec, it's up to you to decide that. The pod preset allowed you to mount them as volumes, inject them as environment variables. I don't remember if it had all the various options, but at least it had those two. And if people wanted more, we were going to add more. So it's very similar to just modifying the pod spec directly.
Okay.
So that's pod preset, and that's a standalone thing that was in the core for a while, and it had nothing to do with service catalog. So then we started talking about, okay, well maybe we should have this pod preset binding thing, which said, as Vile was alluding to, do everything all within one resource, right? Ask for the set of credentials, and then bind them or inject them into your application by allowing you to specify a pod preset template, right? And that's kind of what you're seeing Paul propose for this latest thing, where instead of calling it a pod preset, he's calling it a service key, I think. But I think he's proposing something similar to what we had in the past. And it's because of all these various sort of moving parts. I want to make sure we get the verb and the words right on these things, because pod preset could have been called binding in my opinion, because that's really what it's doing, but we call it pod preset instead, right? But that's why I'm very concerned about what's going to come in the next round when we start introducing words that actually do mean binding. Have we hurt ourselves by calling something binding when all we're doing right now is just asking for credentials or asking for a secret to get created? Anyway, Paul, your hand's up.
So I think that we could probably talk about this for 8 more weeks and not come to a conclusion. We should probably at some point just take a vote on a name. I don't think it should be now. can we do that like in the next couple of days? We are basically very near the point where we need to finalize the API and change the API version over to V1 Beta 1 in order to hit the timelines that we are targeting. So that would be my suggestion.
Okay, so
Vote tomorrow or vote Thursday at the latest.
right, what I would recommend, and I agree with you, what I would recommend is that on tomorrow's call, people present their options they would like people to consider, because I've heard at least 3 different options on this call. I heard call it service key instead, I've heard call it service binding, and I heard your pod preset with service key template thing embedded under that. I can't remember with the outermost.
That's just call it service key.
Okay, service key. So I'd like to have on tomorrow's call, people present the options and then give people a day to think about it. And then I guess on Thursday, vote. Does that sound okay? Because I don't think we want to rush into this decision. So I think it's fair to give people a day to think about what's going to get presented to them tomorrow in terms of list of possible ideas. So Paul, I think your hand's up. Is that it again, or is that old Paul?
That's old.
Okay, Vile, you're up.
So before we do the voting, I would like us to at least agree on what we think the service XYZ is representing, which is why I was trying to go back to Ken's point. We kind of went back and forth on sort of kind of what is it, because there was like, I think Doug or Paul said, look, when you create a service binding, let's call it service binding, in the Kubernetes, it doesn't do anything. It just makes the request. And I'm arguing that that is not true, because it actually does do the same equivalent as it does on Cloud Foundry. It just doesn't stuff them in the environmental variables. It fetches the credentials and stuffs them into secrets. So at least before we do the vote, we should all agree on what we think it does versus what we think it may or may not do.
Can you write that down in the notes? I'm not quite sure if I'm going to get the right words if I try to write that down. Thank you. Any other comments on this one? Okay, so what I'd like to propose is that tomorrow people come with their brilliant ideas for people to consider. And Vile, can you lead the discussion tomorrow on what you just said? Try to get agreement on what we think is going on without, I guess, getting bogged down by the names. Is that what you're trying to look for? Yeah, okay. So is there any disagreement with that plan for tomorrow? Okay, so we'll do that tomorrow then. Morgan, we only have 3 minutes left.
Sorry, Doug. So no. So I basically put this there. Does that give clarity? I'm saying is I don't want this to be a discussion on what should be renamed the service instance credential thingamajiggery, but it should be what should this thing be called, and that thing we need to understand what it represents before we can name it. That's what I'm after. Paul, use your legal words here.
So are you suggesting, Vile, are you suggesting that we have that discussion even before people start thinking about ideas to consider for a vote?
I think it would be fantastic if we at least have a consensus on that. Yes.
Okay.
Because otherwise, what my worry is that we talk about pros and cons of different names on what they sound like before we understand what they represent.
Okay, so let's do that tomorrow then. Let's focus on defining, I guess, the semantics of what this thingy actually is.
Guys, I gotta object to that. We have already discussed as a group that whatever this resource called Service Instance Credential, binding, whatever, represents only a request to Open Service Broker API to get a set of credentials. It does not include any injection semantics.
I don't agree. It does inject them into a credential and namespace. That's what it does to them.
I mean, it only puts them into a secret, and how you wire it to your app is something else. That is what happens.
Not right, but that's what I'm saying. There's a misnotion. You just said it yourself. It represents only a request to OSP, but it's not. It also stuffs them into a namespace secret.
Yes. Parenthesize all of what you said, and that's what it represents. We are out of time to start reassessing this stuff. I think the only question is what is the right name for that concept? Does anybody disagree that, like, the purpose of this seems to be very clear to me? Is it not as clear to everybody else?
So Kent's hand is up. I'm gonna have to go to the queue for right now. And then I think we're gonna have to call time after Kent's gets his point. So Kent, you have the last word.
So Paul, to answer your last question, I think what a binding is, or whatever we're going to call it, is clear to me. And to expand on what Ville said last, he said it's not just a request, or earlier he was using the words declaration of intent. He's saying it's more than that, because you also get back, you get credentials injected into a secret as the response, right? And I think what might be useful to everybody is I actually had to explain yesterday to a Microsoft PM, somebody other than Gabe. I had to explain to him what was a binding. And let me tell you the simple way that I put it to him, and it made sense to him. And if that explanation is something we can all agree on, maybe it moves the needle here a little bit. But what I told him was that it's a declaration of intent to use something, and in exchange for that, you get back a secret that contains credentials. And he was perfectly happy with that explanation.
Okay, I think we're going to have to call time.
That is identical to my understanding of it.
So we're going to have to call time on here, and we'll have to continue tomorrow because I want to be respectful of people having meetings at 5 p.m. Eastern. So we'll talk again tomorrow and continue the exciting, lively discussion.